The gun hit the floor of the saloon before anyone saw James Donnelly move. Eudora Crawford stood with her back against the bar, her chest heaving, her dark eyes wide and bright with something that was not quite fear and not quite fury, but lived somewhere dangerous between the two. The man who had been pressing his hand against her wrist lay on the sawdust floor now, holding his jaw, and James Donnelly stood between them like a wall that the whole territory of New Mexico could not have moved. "You do not touch her again," James said. His voice was so quiet that the piano player stopped playing just to hear it better. The man on the floor, a cattle broker named Haskell who smelled of whiskey and bad intentions, spat blood and looked up at the tall figure above him with genuine calculation in his eyes. He weighed his chances. He found them wanting. "She is not your woman," Haskell said. "No," James agreed, and something in the single word made every man at the bar look away. "She is not, but she is a person, and you will treat her accordingly." The room was suspended. Eudora did not move. She was watching James Donnelly's profile the way a person watches a lightning storm, aware of the danger, unable to look away, feeling something ignite along the edge of her skin that had nothing to do with fear. Then Haskell stood, picked up his hat, and walked out without another word, and the saloon exhaled as one creature. James turned to Eudora. His face in the lamplight was all hard angles and old shadows, the face of a man who had seen too many things from too far a distance, the face of a man who had stopped expecting softness and had built himself accordingly. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. And then, because she was Eudora Crawford and she had never been the kind of woman to leave things unsaid, she added, "Thank you, though I would have managed." "I know you would have," he said, and he meant it. She could tell he meant it, and that made something shift in her chest in a way that alarmed her greatly. He started to turn away. "James," she said. He stopped. He did not turn back immediately. He stopped with his shoulders set and his jaw working slightly, the way a man works his jaw when he is deciding whether the thing behind him is worth the danger of facing it. He turned. And Eudora Crawford, who had come to Cimarron, New Mexico in the spring of 1878 with nothing but a carpetbag, a dead husband's debts, and a stubborn refusal to be broken, looked at this solitary, fortress-built man and said the words that would change both their lives. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "And I think you know that." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight caught the gray at his temples, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind and distance. He was 34 years old, and he looked like a man who had been alone for much longer than that. "Eudora," he said, "I have been alone too long to change." And she held his gaze, steady and unblinking and utterly without apology. "James Donnelly," she said quietly, "I am not asking you to change." The words landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went outward in every direction, and neither of them would ever be quite the same again. But to understand how they arrived at that moment, you have to go back 3 months, to the morning the stage-coach came rattling into Cimarron with its wheels half broken and its passengers shaken like beans in a tin, and Eudora Crawford stepped out of it into the red dust of a New Mexico afternoon and looked at the town that was supposed to save her. It did not look promising. Cimarron in the spring of 1878 was a town that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. It straddled the Cimarron River like an afterthought, a collection of adobe buildings and timber-framed storefronts pressed together against the vastness of the surrounding landscape. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose to the west with an indifference that felt personal. The air smelled of horse and dust, and something sharp and clean underneath that Eudora could not name but would later learn was simply altitude and sage and the particular honesty of open country. She was 30 years old. She had come from St. Louis, Missouri, where she had buried her husband Thomas Crawford 8 months prior, not with grief precisely, because Thomas had been a man with a talent for accumulating debts and a blind faith that tomorrow would resolve all of them. And he had left her with nothing but a house already signed over to creditors and a reputation for stubbornness that served her better anyway. She had sold what little remained of her personal effects, packed the carpetbag, and answered an advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch. Schoolteacher wanted, Cimarron, New Mexico Territory. Single women of good character preferred. Salary negotiable. Room and board provided. She had not asked what negotiable meant. She had assumed it meant sufficient. She was wrong about that too, but she had already arrived, and Eudora Crawford did not go backwards. The man who met the stage was the school board's representative, a florid-faced rancher named Silas Beaumont, who shook her hand with the air of a man completing a business transaction he already regretted. He told her the room above the mercantile was small but functional. He told her the salary was $12 a month. He told her the school had 9 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and that the previous teacher had left under circumstances he would not specify. She asked him to specify them anyway. He said the previous teacher had found the town disagreeable. She said the town had nothing to fear from her on that account. He did not look reassured, which she filed away as interesting. The room above the mercantile was indeed small. It had a rope bed, a washstand, a single window facing west, and a hook on the back of the door. Eudora stood in the center of it and breathed evenly and reminded herself that small rooms were not traps. They were simply rooms with less space to fill with regret. She unpacked her carpetbag methodically. Her clothes, her books, 4 of them, which was 4 more than many women in this territory owned. A photograph of her mother, long dead. A small bottle of lavender water that was more memory than scent at this point. A letter of reference from the principal of the Jefferson School in St. Louis, which spoke of her teaching abilities in terms warm enough to be useful and vague enough to avoid specificity about her personality, which the principal had described privately as formidable. She washed her face and went down to find something to eat. The mercantile was run by a woman named Pearl Gutierrez, who was small and dark and quick in her movements, and who looked at Eudora with the particular assessment of a woman who has seen many newcomers and knows within the first 30 seconds whether they will last. "You are the new schoolteacher," Pearl said. "I am," Eudora said. "You have never been to a town like this before." "No, but I am a quick learner." Pearl looked at her for another moment and then nodded once the way a judge delivers a verdict. "Coffee is on the stove," she said. "Help yourself. Supper is at 6. I do not make exceptions." Eudora helped herself to the coffee and sat down at the rough-hewn table by the window and looked out at the main street of Cimarron and began the process of learning where she had landed. She learned quickly. She was right that she was a quick learner. She learned that the town was organized loosely around 2 competing powers. The first was the Maxwell Land Grant Company, which owned vast tracts of the surrounding territory and employed men to enforce its claims, and which had been the subject of what people called the Colfax County War, a running conflict between the company and the settlers who disputed its boundaries that had been simmering for years and occasionally boiled over into something uglier. She learned that the previous schoolteacher had left because he had inadvertently aligned himself with the wrong side of that dispute and had found it healthier to depart. She learned that Silas Beaumont was a company man and that his friendliness toward her was calculated and that she should be careful about whose invitations she accepted. She learned all of this from Pearl Gutierrez over the course of her first 3 days, and she filed it all carefully in the part of her mind that she reserved for things she needed to understand in order to navigate. She did not learn about James Donnelly for another week. The schoolhouse was a single-room adobe building at the north end of town with a plank floor and 6 benches, and a blackboard that was actually a board painted black, and a stove that required careful management to avoid smoking everyone out. Eudora arrived on her first morning before dawn to build the fire and arrange her 4 books on the small shelf behind the teacher's desk and write the date on the blackboard in her clear, precise hand. The students arrived in a straggle between 7 and 8 o'clock. She took their measure quickly. 3 were children of ranch hands, rough-edged and independent and suspicious. 2 were the children of shop owners, softer and more accustomed to sitting still. One was Pearl Gutierrez's niece, a girl of 10 named Conception who had her aunt's quick eyes and who clearly had no intention of being impressed by anything. The remaining 3 were the children of smaller ranchers, in between in almost every way. Eudora taught them reading and arithmetic, and because she could not help herself, a great deal more. She taught them about the history of the land they stood on, which meant teaching them about the Jicarilla Apache who had lived here long before any of this existed, and about the Spanish land grants that had created the original titles that the Maxwell Land Grant Company was now wielding like a weapon, and about the difference between a legal claim and a just one. Silas Beaumont would hear about that last part eventually. She was aware of that. She taught it anyway. She had been in Cimarron for a week when she first saw James Donnelly. He came into the mercantile on a Thursday afternoon when she was buying writing paper and a new nib for her pen. He was tall, over 6 feet, and lean in the way of men who live physically and eat when they can, not as a discipline but as a fact. He wore a dark canvas coat and a hat that had seen considerable use and boots that were expensive and old. His hair was dark with gray at the temples, and his face was the kind of face that has been weathered by sun and wind and the specific erosion of solitude. He nodded at Pearl. He placed a list on the counter. He waited while Pearl assembled the items on the list: flour, salt, dried beans, ammunition for a Winchester rifle, a new pair of leather gloves, a small bottle of linseed oil, and he said exactly nothing that was not required by the transaction. Eudora watched him from the corner of her eye while she made her own selection. Pearl said, "Eudora, this is James Donnelly. He has the Caldera Ranch north of town." James Donnelly turned and looked at her. His eyes were the color of a river in winter, gray-blue and deep and not unfriendly exactly, but not warm either. The eyes of a man who has learned to observe without revealing. "Miss Crawford," he said. "Mrs.," she said from habit, and then corrected herself. "Actually, it is Miss now, or simply Eudora." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, not quite softening, more like recalibration. "Eudora," he said, and the way he said her name, not testing it, not making anything of it, just using it plainly, sent a small, specific warmth through her that she noted and set carefully aside. "James Donnelly," she said. "James," he said. They looked at each other for a moment longer than was strictly accounted for by courtesy. Then he took his supplies, settled his account with Pearl, nodded to them both, and left. Eudora looked at Pearl, who was looking at her with an expression of elaborate neutrality. "He has the Caldera Ranch north of town," Eudora repeated. 40 square miles, Pearl said. "Cattle and horses. He built it himself." "Is he married?" "No, he was, years ago. She died. Fever." Pearl paused, folding the paper of James's receipt with deliberate attention. "He has been alone since. That is about 8 years now." "He does not seem like a man who minds it," Eudora said. "He does not seem like a man who admits to minding anything," Pearl said. "That is a different thing." Eudora carried her writing paper back to the room above the mercantile and sat at the small desk and thought about the difference between those two things for longer than she intended. She saw him again the following Sunday. Cimarron had a small church, a non-denominational arrangement conducted by a traveling preacher named Reverend Aldous Clay, who came through every 2 weeks and was more interested in community than doctrine, which Eudora appreciated. She attended the first Sunday not from deep religious conviction, but from the recognition that a new schoolteacher in a small town needed to be visible and available in the spaces where the community gathered. James Donnelly sat in the back row, which told her something. He was present, which told her something else. He sat with his hat on his knee and his eyes forward, and his posture the particular posture of a man who is accustomed to being in open spaces and finds enclosed ones endurable but not natural. After the service, people gathered outside in the mild spring air. Eudora was introduced to a half-dozen people she needed to know: the doctor, a quiet Pennsylvanian named Dr. Samuel Voss, who shook her hand with a warmth that felt genuine; the blacksmith, a massive, gentle man named Edgar Foote who spoke to her about his daughter's progress in school with a pride that was entirely unself-conscious. The wife of the postmaster, a woman named Agnes Reed who looked at Eudora with the bright, assessing eyes of someone who was already composing a letter about her to a friend in Santa Fe. James Donnelly stood apart from these introductions, not unfriendly, speaking when spoken to, holding his coffee with both hands the way a man holds something warm when warmth is not something he is accustomed to seeking. She made her way to him eventually because she was not a woman who orbited anything. She moved toward things directly or not at all. "Your ranch," she said. 40 square miles. What do you run?" He looked at her with that recalibrating expression as if she kept requiring adjustments to his expectations. "About 200 head of cattle," he said. 60 horses, 12 breeding mares." "Do you have help?" "2 ranch hands, brothers name of Alvarez, Manuel and Teodoro." "And you built it yourself," she said. "Pearl told me." "Pearl tells people things," he said without any heat. "She told me you have been alone for 8 years, Eudora said, because she had decided she was not going to dance around the things she actually wanted to know. He was still for a moment. Not uncomfortable, she got the impression that discomfort was not an emotion James Donnelly entertained frequently, more like a man deciding whether a question has been asked in good faith. "That is accurate," he said. "Is it by choice?" He considered this with the same deliberate care he seemed to apply to everything. "At first it was not," he said. "Then it was. Then it became habit. Now I am not certain there is a meaningful distinction between choosing a thing and simply having become it." Eudora looked at him steadily. "I think there is always a meaningful distinction," she said, "whether we make use of it or not." He held her gaze for a moment. "You are very direct," he said, not as a criticism, as an observation. "I have found indirection to be an expensive luxury," she said, "particularly for women." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the ghost of one perhaps if a smile had been something he did more often. Reverend Clay called something to him then, and he excused himself with a nod that she recognized as genuine, and she watched him cross the dusty churchyard and thought about expensive luxuries and the things people choose, and the things they simply become, and she was aware, with the clarity she tried to apply to everything, that something had begun. The weeks that followed were the weeks of spring turning toward summer, and Cimarron warmed and the mountains were still white at the peaks, and the meadows along the river went green, and the cottonwoods leafed out along the banks. Eudora taught her 9 students 5 days a week, and on Saturday mornings she had added 2 adults, Manuel Alvarez, who wanted to improve his English reading, and a young woman named Della Watts who was 17 and had missed most of her schooling, and who had a fierce, hungry intelligence that Eudora recognized with a jolt as similar to her own. James Donnelly appeared in her daily life with the irregularity of a man who does not plan his appearances but who is somehow reliably present. He came to the Mercantile every week and twice she was there. He attended Reverend Clay's services when the preacher came through and always sat in the back and always left before the coffee was gone but after she had noticed him. Once he had occasion to speak to her briefly on the street about a matter involving his ranch hand's daughter, who was one of her students and had missed 2 weeks of school. He wanted to understand if the girl was behind. Eudora told him the girl was quick enough to make it up. He thanked her. Their conversation lasted 8 minutes by the clock above the barber shop across the street, and she thought about it for most of the evening. She was not falling in love with him. She was clear about this. She was a woman who had made one marriage of convenience and comfort and moderate affection, and had not found it particularly fulfilling, and was in no hurry to make another arrangement of any kind. She was interested in James Donnelly, the way an intelligent person is interested in a complicated problem, with the feeling that understanding it would be worth the effort required. But she noticed things about him that she could not strictly attribute to intellectual interest. She noticed that he was unfailingly courteous to everyone he spoke to, with a specificity to his courtesy that suggested it was not social habit, but genuine regard. He remembered people's names and the names of their children and the details of their situations. He asked after the things they had told him mattered to them. He did this quietly, without the performance that turns kindness into a transaction. She noticed that he never spoke ill of anyone. Not in the way of people who refuse to gossip because they fear being caught in it, but in the way of a man who has looked at enough human failing, including his own, to have arrived at a kind of philosophical patience about it. She noticed that he was the only man in town who did not seem to have an opinion about how she should be conducting herself or her school or her life, and that this absence of opinion was not indifference but something more like respect, and that she had not realized until it was present how much she had needed it. She noticed that when he looked at her, and he did look at her, she was not imagining that his eyes were different from the way they were when he looked at other people. Not warmer, exactly. More present, more like someone who has stepped closer. She told herself she was being fanciful. She had work to do. The event that changed things was not romantic. It was a Thursday evening in late May, and she had stayed late at the schoolhouse grading arithmetic sheets, and she was walking back along the main street in the long light of a New Mexico evening when she heard the argument coming from inside the Cimarron saloon. She was not the kind of woman who went into saloons. This was 1878, and the social code around such things was rigid, and she was a schoolteacher in a town where her reputation was her employment. But the voice she could hear above the others was one she knew, Della Watts, 17 years old, who should not have been in a saloon. Eudora went in. Della was standing at the bar, or rather she was being prevented from leaving the bar by the hand of Haskell, the cattle broker, on her wrist. Haskell was drunk and ugly with it, and had the blind confidence of a man accustomed to a world that structured itself around his convenience. "Let her go," Eudora said clearly, from the doorway. The saloon went quiet with the particular attention of a room full of men who are surprised and entertained by the same thing at once. Haskell looked at her with the exaggerated patience of the drunk. "Well, well," he said, "the schoolteacher." "Let go of that girl's wrist," Eudora said. She walked in. She did not hurry. She kept her voice even and her eyes on Haskell, and she was aware that her heart was going very fast, and she did not show it. "She is 17 years old, and you will release her immediately." "Or what?" Haskell said, with a smile that made every woman in the history of the world feel the same specific coldness. "Or I will find something in this room with which to make my point more physically," Eudora said, and she looked around the bar with the air of someone conducting an inventory. There was a beat of something, Haskell's drunk amusement, the room's suspended attention, and then he released Della's wrist and turned the full force of his unpleasant attention on Eudora instead, stepping toward her, and she held her ground because there was nothing else to do. And then Haskell stopped moving because James Donnelly had come through the door behind her and placed himself in the space between her and Haskell with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided something and is not going to be argued out of it. What followed was the scene you already know. Haskell on the floor, the gun untouched but present as a fact of the room. James's voice so quiet the piano player stopped playing, Haskell leaving, the saloon exhaling. Della had gone, slipping out in the disturbance, and Eudora would speak to her tomorrow and she was fine, and none of that is the point. The point is what Eudora said to James when he tried to leave. "I am not going anywhere, and I think you know that. And then, I am not asking you to change." She watched those words go into him the way you watch a key go into a lock that has been locked for a long time, the mechanism working, the resistance giving way, the thing inside the door moving with a sound almost too quiet to hear. He looked at her for a long time in the lamplight of the Cimarron saloon with the smell of whiskey and sawdust around them and the other men finding urgent business elsewhere, and he said nothing at all. But he did not leave. He said finally, "You are a dangerous woman, Eudora Crawford." "I have been called worse," she said. "I mean it as a compliment," he said. "I know you do," she said. And they stood in that space between the words they had exchanged and the things they had not yet said, And eventually she said she ought to get back, and he said he would walk her, which was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. The town was quiet, and the stars above the New Mexico plateau were extravagant in their brightness, the kind of sky that a person from St. Louis sees and does not quite believe. They walked without hurrying and without touching, but close enough that the warmth between them was a physical thing, a presence beside the absence of words. At the door of the mercantile he stopped, and she stopped with him. "What you said in there," he said. "Yes," she said. Because she was not going to help him avoid it by pretending she did not know what he meant. "I have been—" He stopped, tried again. The effort of it was visible, the way the effort of moving something long unused is visible. "I have spent a considerable amount of time constructing reasons why this kind of thing is not possible for me." "I know," she said, "and you are not convinced by them." "I am convinced by evidence," she said. "And the evidence is that you are a careful, solitary, decent man who has been in this position before and has suffered for it, and who has decided that the suffering is preferable to the risk. And I understand that. I was married for 6 years to a man who was kind and irresponsible, and who died and left me in debt, and I had no one to be angry at, and I understand the particular logic of deciding that attachment is not worth the cost." He was very still. "But I do not believe it," she said. "The logic, it is sound as logic, it is not sound as a life." He looked at her with those Winter River eyes, and she could see the conflict in them, and it was not the conflict of a man who did not want the thing being offered, but the conflict of a man who was afraid of how much he did. "What are you asking of me?" he said quietly. "I told you," she said. "I am not asking you to change. I am not asking you to become someone else, or to pretend you are easy with people when you are not, or to want things you do not want, or to give up the ranch or your solitude or any of the things that are genuinely you. I am asking you to let me know you. That is all. To let me be a person you know and who knows you. What follows from that we can—" She paused, and she was startled to find herself suddenly less composed than she had been all evening. "We can take as it comes." He was quiet for long enough that the nighthawk calling somewhere in the cottonwoods along the river made its full, looping sound twice. "I have forgotten how to be known," he said. And the simplicity of it, the complete absence of self-pity in it, hit her with a force she had not anticipated. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "I can remind you." He looked at her in the starlight. Then he said good night and went home, and she went upstairs to her small room, and she lay awake looking at the ceiling and feeling the specific, alarming, glorious sensation of something beginning that she had not expected to feel again. June came in hot and high. He began stopping at the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons, which was when she stayed after the students left to prepare for the following week. The first time he brought a problem with him, a question about whether there was a letter he needed to write to the land grant company regarding a boundary dispute, and she helped him draft it, and they sat across from each other at the small teacher's desk while she wrote, and he read what she wrote and occasionally said, "Yes, that is what I mean," or "That is not quite it," in a way that was careful and specific, and suggested he had thought deeply about what he meant and wanted her to get it right. The second Friday he came without a pretext, and they both understood this, and neither of them mentioned it. She showed him the book she was teaching the older children, Washington Irving's account of the American West, which was at least a quarter nonsense and nearly half mythology, but contained passages of genuine beauty. He read the passages she indicated with the concentrated attention he gave to everything, and he said, without looking up from the page, "He was never really here." "No," she said, "but he understood something about what the idea of here does to people." He looked up at that. "What does it do to you?" She thought about it honestly. "It makes me feel very small," she said, "but in a way I had not expected to find restful, not insignificant. Small in proportion to something real. In St. Louis the smallness was just social. Here it is." She searched for the word. "Geological," he said. "Yes," she said, and laughed, and the laugh surprised both of them because it was entirely unguarded, and James Donnelly looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize but that had warmth in it, something that moved in his eyes like the first indication of spring in still water. "I think it is what kept me here," he said, "after Clara died. I could have sold the ranch and gone back east. I could have gone to California. But the scale of the place, it made the grief the right size. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," she said. And then, because this was the first time he had mentioned Clara voluntarily, she said carefully, "Tell me about her." He was quiet, but it was not a warning quiet. It was the quiet of someone finding words for something. "She was from Ohio," he said. "Practical, funny, in a dry way that ambushed you. She was not afraid of work. She came out here with me when this was," he gestured outward, meaning before the ranch, meaning before any of it was built, when there was nothing, and she did not flinch. "She sounds remarkable," Eudora said. "She was," he said simply. "And then she got sick. The spring of 1870, typhoid, doctor." Voss thought, though he was not certain. She was gone in 3 weeks. He was still looking out the window. "I was 26 years old, and I did not know how to be a person without her, and I did not find out for a long time. And now," Eudora said, he turned and looked at her. "Now," he said, "I think I am beginning to remember." The sound of the evening insects came through the window. The light was long and golden. They were 2 feet apart across the teacher's desk, and it felt like both more and less than that. She reached across the desk and put her hand over his. It was a gesture of comfort but also of claiming, and she meant both. He looked down at their hands. He turned his over and held hers. They stayed like that for a while, and the evening came in around them, and neither of them needed to say anything about it. The difficulty arrived in early July, because in Cimarron in 1878 difficulty was as reliable as weather. Silas Beaumont had been watching Eudora with the narrowed attention of a man whose interests were being disrupted. And what disrupted them was this. She had been teaching her students about the disputed land grants in factual, historical terms, and word had gotten back to him, as it gets back to powerful men, amplified and distorted but not entirely wrong. He came to the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon with the self-assurance of a man who has never been told no by someone he considered beneath him. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, and she allowed the missus because correcting Silas Beaumont on her name was a battle she chose not to fight that day. "Mr. Beaumont," she said. She continued erasing the blackboard. "I have received some concerning reports," he said. "Reports about what?" she said, knowing. "About the content of your curriculum. Specifically regarding the matter of land titles in this county." He settled his weight in the way of a man who expects the next part of the conversation to go a certain way. "As a representative of the school board, I want to be certain that your instruction is impartial." Eudora set down her eraser. She turned and looked at him. "I teach history," she said. "History is not impartial, it is factual. The Bobian-Miranda grant was valid under Mexican law. The United States acquired it under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Maxwell Land Grant Company purchased it. The question of whether they are enforcing its boundaries correctly, or whether the boundaries were accurately described, is a legal dispute that has been going through courts for years. I tell my students what is established as fact, and I distinguish it from what is in dispute. That is what a teacher is supposed to do." Beaumont's face had gone the color of a late summer sunset, warm and ominous. "The school board has the authority to review the curriculum," he said. "The school board has that authority," she agreed. "The school board does not have the authority to instruct me to teach children that a disputed claim is settled simply because it benefits one party on the board." She held his gaze steadily. "I am aware of your involvement with the Maxwell Land Grant Company, Mr. Beaumont. I am certain you are aware of the appearance of a conflict of interest." He left without resolving anything, which was in some ways worse than an outright confrontation because it meant the thing was still unfinished and growing. She told James about it that Friday. He listened with the concentration he gave to important things, and when she was done he said, "He will attempt to dismiss you." "I expect so," she said. "What will you do?" "I will refuse to be dismissed," she said, "and I will continue teaching what is true." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will speak to the other board members. James Beaumont has 2 allies on the board and 2 who are independent," he said. "I know the independents, Charlie Ruiz and Edgar Foote. They are reasonable men. I do not want you to fight my battles for me," she said, not with anger but with precision. "I know you do not," he said, "but there is a difference between fighting your battle for you and lending you an ally. You would do the same." She looked at him. She recognized the logic. She recognized also that he was right, and that the offer was not made from condescension but from the specific, practical care of a man who had identified something he valued, and was not inclined to watch it be needlessly damaged. "Thank you," she said. "All right." He went to see Charlie Ruiz and Edgar Foote, and she never knew exactly what he said to them. But when the school board met 2 weeks later and Beaumont moved to review her curriculum and potentially dismiss her, Ruiz and Foote voted against him, and the motion failed, and Beaumont sat in his chair with the controlled fury of a man who had expected an easy victory and found instead a wall. Eudora kept her position. She did not change her curriculum. What she felt that evening when Pearl told her the vote results was something specific and strong that was not simply relief. It was the feeling of not being alone in something, of having the particular solid backup of someone who had said, "I see what you are doing and I am with you." No conditions, no management of her choices, simply with her. She thought about that for a long time. August. He took her riding on a Sunday afternoon. She had expressed interest in the landscape beyond the town, the mesas and canyons and high meadows of the Cimarron range, and he had said, without making a moment of it, that he knew it well. She could ride well enough, city-trained on borrowed horses in the parks of St. Louis, which was not quite the same as riding in New Mexico territory. But she was physically capable and adaptable, and the horse he brought her was a dark bay mare named Dulce, who was patient and responsive and clearly chosen with care. They rode north from town into country that rose steadily toward the mountains, through pinyon and juniper, and then into stands of ponderosa that smelled of warm resin in the afternoon sun, along draws where the water ran clear and cold over red stone, up onto benches that looked out over the valley below with the kind of view that makes a person understand why people come to places and stay. James rode with the easy, unconscious competence of a man who has spent 20 years on horseback, and he was not a different person out here, but he was somehow more himself. The constraint that he carried in social spaces fell away in the open country. He spoke more freely. He pointed things out with the proprietary pleasure of a man showing someone a place he loves, a hawk's nest in the cliff face above them, the tracks of an elk in the soft ground near a spring, the remnants of an ancient building, probably ancestral puebloin, its stone walls collapsed into the grass of a high meadow. "How old?" she asked, stopping to look. 800 years, he said. "Maybe more. Doctor." Voss has been corresponding with some men in the East about the archaeology of this region. There are similar sites all over the Colfax. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the old stones. "I have been here 15 years, and sometimes I feel as though I have not been here any time at all." "The geological scale," she said. He smiled at her. A full, real smile, which was rare enough that it stopped her breath for a moment. He had a good smile. It altered his face entirely, opened it up, showed the man underneath the weathered surface. They ate their midday meal on a flat rock above the valley, bread and cheese and dried apricots that Pearl had put in a cloth bag with a small knowing expression. And they sat with their shoulders close and the horses ground-tied below them and the whole of the Cimarron country spread out in its afternoon light. And Eudora thought, "I am happy." Not contentedly, not as a relief from some previous state, but straightforwardly, with the specific texture of happiness that involves being exactly where you are with exactly who you are with and wanting nothing different. She leaned her head very briefly against his shoulder. He did not move away. After a moment his arm came around her in a careful, tentative way, as if he were testing whether the thing he wanted to do was permitted. She leaned into it. "I have not," he started, stopped, tried again. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "The morning after the saloon," he said. "What you said. I rode back to the ranch and I spent the next 2 days trying to find the flaw in it. The flaw in the argument you made. I am not asking you to change." "And," she said. "There is no flaw," he said. "If you are not asking me to change, if you are genuinely not, then I have no logical defense." "Love is not a logical defense question," she said. The word landed and they both felt it land. He turned his head and looked at her. Very close now, the afternoon light on the planes of his face, his eyes dark and present and entirely open in a way she suspected they were rarely open to anyone. "No," he said softly, "I suppose it is not." She kissed him first because she could see that he would wait if she did not, would hold himself at the edge of the thing indefinitely out of care for her, out of the habit of restraint, and she was not interested in waiting any more. She put her hand against his face and kissed him in the full afternoon sun above the valley, and he went still for a single moment, and then kissed her back with a depth and a specific, concentrated warmth that was entirely and completely him. Not practiced, not performed, but real, the way everything about him was real. When they broke apart, he kept his hand at the side of her face and looked at her with something she could only call wonder, which sat so unexpectedly on that weathered, careful face that she felt her eyes sting. "Eudora," he said. "James," she said. They sat like that in the afternoon sun for a long while longer, and the hawks circled above the cliff, and the horses grazed in the grass below, and the mountains stood in their ancient indifference around them, and neither of them said anything that needed to be said because everything that needed to be said had already been said. The months that followed were the months of a courtship conducted in the specific terms of who they each were. He came to town more often. Not daily. He was a rancher, and he had a ranch that required him to be on it, but with a regularity that was new and noticed. He came on Fridays when she stayed late at the schoolhouse, and on Sunday mornings for the church service, and occasionally on weekday evenings when something brought him to town, and he found occasion to stop at the mercantile, and then remain for supper at Pearl's table. Pearl fed them both with the satisfied energy of a woman who has seen something she wanted to see happen, and is pleased with herself for the role she may or may not have played in it. She asked James questions about the ranch with the air of someone conducting a reference check, and he answered them with complete patience. She told Eudora on a morning when James was not present that he was the best man in the county and that she had thought so for years and that she hoped Eudora had the sense to recognize it. "I recognized it rather quickly," Eudora said with some dryness. "Good," Pearl said. "Men like that do not appear often." He introduced her to his ranch, formally and with a specific pride that moved her. He drove her out in his wagon one Saturday in September, the mountains already dusted with new snow at the peaks, the aspens going golden below the timber line. The Caldera Ranch was a spread of good pasture land in a wide valley fed by a spring-fed creek, with a main house that James had built himself over the course of his first 5 years here, adobe walls, thick enough to keep cool in summer and warm in winter, a timber-framed porch that ran along the south face, a kitchen that was larger than the main house of some establishments in town, because he had understood from the beginning that a kitchen was where the real life of a house happened. Manuel and Teodoro Alvarez met her with the combination of warmth and evaluation that she had come to expect from people who cared about James, pleased to meet her, taking her measure, wanting to know if she was worthy of him. Manuel, who was her Saturday student, shook her hand with the formality of a man using his improved English for something that mattered to him. Teodoro, who was 19 and still had the directness of the young, simply said, "He has been different since he met you." Better different. James looked at Teodoro with an expression of mild exasperation that Eudora found entirely endearing. She walked through the main house with him, and she could see him everywhere in it in the care of the construction, the solidity of the furniture he had built or bought for keeping rather than display, the shelf of books that was larger than she had expected and contained geology, natural history, a volume of Thoreau, the complete plays of Shakespeare, a Spanish grammar, and a battered copy of Marcus Aurelius that had clearly been read many times. She pulled out the Marcus Aurelius. "Of course," she said, smiling. "It is useful," he said, with a defensiveness that was purely habitual. "It is very useful," she agreed. She opened it to a page at random and read aloud. "Do not indulge in dreams of what you have not, but reckon up the chief of the blessings you do possess." She looked up at him. "Good advice. I have tried to follow it," he said, "some years with more success than others." She set the book back on the shelf and turned to him and took his hand. "James," she said, "this is a wonderful place." He looked at her in his house, in the autumn light coming through the south windows, and she could see him taking in the fact of her here, standing in the space he had built, and the life he had constructed, and the solitude he had cultivated, and finding not intrusion but completion, and the weight of that recognition moving through him like the particular shift of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is just now setting it down. "I thought so once," he said. I had stopped thinking of it as he searched for the word. "Home," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "I had begun to think of it as a place I lived." She moved to him and put her arms around him, which she had done before, but not here, not in this space, and he held her in a way that said something neither of them had yet said directly. October. She was grading papers at her desk in the schoolhouse after dark when she heard the knock on the door. She was not alarmed. Cimarron was not a place without its dangers, but she had developed a working knowledge of its rhythms, and a knock was not a danger. It was James. He came in out of the October cold and stood in the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, which was nervousness. Not anxiety. James was not an anxious man, but the specific, focused nervousness of a person who has made a decision and is about to enact it. "I need to say something to you," he said. "All right," she said, and she set down her pen and gave him her full attention. He was quiet for a moment. In the lamplight he was very vivid, present in the way he always was, but more so now, the guard further down than usual, the underlying self more visible. "I told you in August that I had spent years constructing reasons why this was not possible for me," he said, "that I had been alone too long to change. You told me you were not asking me to change." "I remember," she said. "I have been thinking about those two statements every day since August," he said, "and I have arrived at a conclusion." "Tell me your conclusion," she said. "My conclusion is that you were right," he said, "and I was wrong. Not about the fact I have been alone a long time. I have been shaped by that time. I am still, in many ways, a solitary person, and I expect I will remain one. But I was using that fact as a hiding place, as a reason not to do the thing I was afraid of doing." "You were being rational about an irrational thing," she said. "I understand the impulse." "I want to marry you," he said, with the same directness he gave to everything now that he had started. "That is my conclusion. I want to marry you, and I want you to live on the ranch, and I understand that you have your teaching, and I would not want to change that. I meant it when I said I was not going to manage your choices. The school needs you, and you love it, and I would never—" "James," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. He was still for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. And she rose from the desk and came to him and took his face in both hands and looked at him with everything she felt, directly, the way she looked at everything. He wrapped his arms around her, and she could feel the depth of his relief and his happiness and the particular vibration of a man who has been tightly controlled for a long time and is finally, fully present, and she thought, "This is what it is. This is what it is when it is real." He kissed her and she kissed him back, and the lamp burned steadily in the old schoolhouse, and October sat dark and cold outside the windows, and none of that mattered at all. They were married in November. Reverend Clay, pleased and slightly surprised, conducted the service in the little church with more warmth than ceremony. Pearl Gutierrez stood beside Eudora as her witness, holding a handkerchief she did not use because she was not, she specified, a woman who cried at weddings. Teodoro Alvarez stood beside James and was visibly moved in the uncomplicated way of the young. Manuel sat in the front row and watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood that something important was being formalized. Eudora wore a dress of deep blue wool that Pearl had helped her make, not a wedding dress in the traditional sense, being neither white nor particularly elaborate, but fine and carefully made and suited to her, which was more important. She carried a small bunch of late-season sage and dried wildflowers that Concepcion Gutierrez had assembled with the creative intensity she brought to everything. James stood at the front of the church in his good dark coat and looked at Eudora coming toward him with an expression on his face that made every woman present, and there were 11, which was a significant fraction of the women in Cimarron, reach for a handkerchief. They said their vows in plain language, Reverend Clay's simple version, and then James said something that was not part of the ceremony quietly for her alone. "I am not changed," he said, "but I am changed by you, and I think that is different." "It is entirely different," she said. She moved to the ranch. She had known the small room above the mercantile for 9 months, and she had been sufficient unto it, but she was not sorry to leave it. She arranged her books on the shelf beside his, Thoreau and Marcus Aurelius making room for Washington Irving and a collection of English poetry and a botany text she had brought from St. Louis. She planted 4 things in the kitchen garden that had gone fallow: winter onions, garlic, and 2 climbing roses that she had received from Mrs. Foote, who propagated them every year and gave them to people she approved of. She drove the wagon to town 5 days a week to teach, and came home in the evenings to the ranch and to him, and the rhythm of it was good, solid, and workable, 2 independent people building a shared thing without demanding that either of them stop being who they were. He was not easy in the ways that are sometimes mistaken for affection. He was not demonstrative in company. He was still, fundamentally, a person who found solitude restorative and crowds effortful. He could go a whole morning at the kitchen table without speaking. There were evenings when he came in from a hard day's work, and he was quiet in the contained, inward way that she recognized as simply him and not withdrawal or distance, and she let him be quiet and read her book beside the fire and did not require performance of ease that cost him something to give. He recognized this. He recognized it explicitly, because he was a man who believed in naming the things that mattered. "You do not try to fill the quiet," he said one evening, without preamble. "The quiet does not need filling," she said. Clara was the same, he said, and she noted without defensiveness that the comparison was offered as respect and received it as such. "Some people cannot tolerate silence with another person. They believe it means something is wrong." "Something is right," she said. "2 people who can be quiet together trust each other." He looked at her over the lamp. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." He loved her in the ways she had not expected, which were the more meaningful ways. He read things she recommended and discussed them with her with genuine engagement, disagreeing when he disagreed, which she valued more than agreement. He fixed things that needed fixing without making a production of it, which was a form of care she had not recognized as such until it was present. He listened, really listened, the way people rarely do, when she spoke about her students or her frustrations or the thoughts she had not quite worked through yet, and he did not fix what did not need fixing. He simply was present for it. He held her at night with the complete and uncomplicated reality of a man who has stopped negotiating with his own need for closeness and has simply accepted it as part of himself. She would wake sometimes in the night and find his arm around her and feel, in those unguarded moments, a happiness so clear and clean that it required no analysis. December brought the first real snow of the season, and January brought the cold that the mountains stored up during fall and released all at once, and the ranch in winter was a different thing than the ranch in summer, harder, quieter, more concentrated, the days short and the work heavy and the evenings long and lamplit and entirely their own. She was pregnant by February. She knew before she was certain, the way women know, the specific shift in her body's relationship with itself. She told him on a Sunday evening after supper when they were sitting by the fire, and he was reading his Marcus Aurelius, and she was mending one of his shirts because the button had come off and she had the needle already in hand. "James," she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately. He was always attuned to the register of her voice. She told him. The expression that moved over his face was like watching the season change fast, complex, layered. Something very old, which was grief briefly surfaced and then processed. Something present, which was a happiness so complete it seemed almost to hurt him. Something that settled finally into a certainty that was, she realized, the expression of a man who has just understood something he had been moving toward for years. He came to her and took her hands and held them and looked at her with everything. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Somewhat tired, but well." "You should not be driving the wagon every day in, James." He stopped. "I will continue to teach until I am not able to," she said. "And then I will stop and then I will return. We will work it out." He looked at her. He let out a long breath. "Yes," he said. "All right, we will work it out." "I told you," she said gently. "Not asking you to change. Remember," he laughed, and it was the good laugh, the full one, and he pulled her close and held her and she could feel the beat of his heart against her cheek and she thought about geological scale and the way things that seem improbable become, over time, simply the shape of the world. Spring came again. The cottonwoods leafed out. The aspens sent up new growth. The breeding mares foaled, and Manuel and Teodoro moved between the foaling barn and the pastures, with the particular absorbed attention of men doing important work well. And the school came to the end of its second year, with 9 students somewhat more educated than they had been at its beginning and one Della Watts, who was 18 now, and whose hunger for learning had not diminished, but intensified, who was preparing to write to a school in Santa Fe about the possibility of a teaching certificate. Eudora had written the letter of recommendation herself. She had made it formidable. In June, Eudora stopped driving the wagon to school. The ride was too long and the road was rough, and she was very much with child by then, and there was no point in making it harder than it needed to be. Young Concepcion Gutierrez, who was 12 and entirely competent, took the older students through their reading assignments in Eudora's absence, and Eudora came in twice a week when James drove her in the wagon on the smooth road from the north and sat at her desk and conducted what teaching she could. The baby came on a July morning, with Dr. Voss in attendance and Pearl Gutierrez present in the way that Pearl was present for everything important in Cimarron, efficiently, warmly, entirely capable. James was in the house. He would have been in the room if Eudora had allowed it, and she had not, because she was, in the end, a practical woman who knew that some things are better managed without an audience. But he was there, present in the ranch house with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, a concentrated attention turned inward toward the room where she was. The baby was a boy, dark-haired, loud, emphatically alive. Dr. Voss said he was entirely healthy and that Eudora was entirely healthy, and departed with the satisfied expression of a doctor who has attended an event that went correctly. James came in and saw his son for the first time, and what happened to his face was private and total. He sat on the edge of the bed and took the baby very carefully and held him with the same careful precision he brought to everything and looked at him for a long time and then looked at Eudora. "He has your eyes," she said, though he was an hour old and it was impossible to tell anything yet. "He is extraordinary," James said, with the plain simplicity of a man for whom extraordinary was not a word he used frequently, and who therefore could be trusted when he did. "He needs a name," Eudora said. They had discussed names. James had suggested his father's name, which was William, and she had liked it. She had suggested Clara if the baby were a girl, because she was not a woman made small by her predecessor's memory, but one who understood that love lived in layers and did not require the deletion of what came before. "William," James said. "William James Donnelly," Eudora said. "Hello, William." William James Donnelly expressed his opinion of his name by going to sleep, which they both agreed was the correct response. The months after William's birth were exhausting and transforming in the way of all new parenthood, which altered the structure of their days and the texture of their nights, and the definition of what constituted a crisis. And through all of it, the thing between them, the specific, hard-won, carefully built thing, did not fracture or strain, but simply expanded to include this new dimension. The way a good house expands to include new life without losing its fundamental integrity. James was not, it turned out, a man who was made awkward by fatherhood. He took to it with the same practical competence he brought to everything he cared about, the same combination of attention and patience. And he learned quickly the particular physical language of an infant, in a way that Eudora found unexpectedly affecting this solitary, self-sufficient, fortress-built man learning to read the very specific communication of a small person who could not yet speak, but had a great deal to say. Eudora returned to teaching in September, with William in a basket on the floor beside her desk for the first weeks, until he outgrew the basket and Pearl volunteered to look after him during school hours, which Pearl specified was not sentiment but practicality, and which was both. The school year had 10 students now. The word had gotten around. She taught them history and arithmetic and reading and science and geography. And she told them the truth about the land they lived on, and the people who had been here before them and the complex, contested, often unjust processes by which this territory had come to be what it was. And Silas Beaumont continued to disapprove, and continued to find his disapproval insufficient to stop her. Because Charlie Ruiz and Edgar Foote remained on the school board and remained reasonable men, and because Eudora Crawford Donnelly was not a force that reasonable opposition could redirect once she had determined her direction. The second year at the ranch. Manuel Alvarez, who had been reading with Eudora for nearly 2 years, sat down one Saturday morning and read aloud from Washington Irving without stumbling and looked up from the page with an expression that she recognized as the particular fierce pride of a person who has done something they were not certain they could do. "Manuel," she said, "that was excellent. I want to write a letter," he said, "to my mother, in Chihuahua, in English, so she can show people." "Then we will write it," Eudora said. They wrote it together, Manuel choosing each word with the care of someone building something important, and Eudora writing what he chose and suggesting alternatives when the alternatives were better. And at the end of it, he held the letter and read it through, and his eyes were bright, and she thought about the injustices that had made his mother's world and his world separate by more than the distance between Chihuahua and New Mexico, the border that shifted and the languages it divided, and the lives it cut across. And she thought about the fact that she could teach, and she could write letters with people, and she could show her students the difference between a just claim and a legal one. And these were small actions against large forces, but they were not nothing. She told James about it that evening. He listened with the full attention he gave her. "Do you ever think about what this place will be in 20 years?" she said. "Yes," he said, "often." "What do you think it will be?" He was quiet, considering it honestly. "I think the land grant disputes will be resolved by courts, one way or another," he said. "I think the territory will become a state. I think the Apache will continue to be treated unjustly by the federal government, and that this will be a permanent wound in the history of this land. I think the towns will grow. I think the ranches will face pressure from the railroads and the changes they bring." He paused. "I think that people like Manuel and Teodoro and Concepcion and Della, people with the intelligence and will to navigate the changing of things, will find their way through it if they have the tools they need." "Which is why the school matters," she said. "Which is why the school matters," he agreed. "And why you matter, specifically, not generically." She looked at him across the table and felt the familiar warmth of being accurately seen. "I was terrified when I stepped off that stage," she said. "I did not show it, but I was. I had nothing, and I was in a place I did not know, and I had built so much of my identity on being self-sufficient that I had not left any room in it for needing anything. And now," he said, "now I have you," she said, "and William, and Pearl, who I am fairly certain has adopted me without asking, and my students, and this ranch which is extraordinary, and the mountains. She looked out the south window at the last light on the mountains. I have a great deal. I did not expect to have a great deal. He reached across the table and took her hand. You were always going to have a great deal, he said. The question was only which great deal it was going to be. She turned her hand and held his. William, in his cradle by the fire, made the particular sound he made before falling deeply asleep, a small, satisfied sound that was one of the best sounds in the world. They sat together in the lamplight of the ranch house, while the October darkness came down outside, and the fire went warm, and the mountain stood in the early dark, and neither of them needed to say anything at all, because they had said everything that needed saying, and the rest was simply this: the living of it. James doubled the cattle operation the following spring, which meant additional hands, which meant a bunkhouse that was currently inadequate, which meant 6 weeks of construction during which he was covered in adobe mud every evening and deeply happy about it, in the way of a man whose hands need to be making something. Eudora brought him coffee at the building site on Saturday afternoons and sometimes helped, which surprised the new hands and seemed entirely natural to Manuel and Teodoro, who had by now developed the proprietary attitude of men who have known someone's marriage from its beginning and feel entitled to a mild pride in it. Della Watts came back to Cimarron in June of the year after, with a teaching certificate from Santa Fe and a manner that was exactly herself but more so, the fierceness refined, the intelligence now equipped, the hunger directed. She was 19. She came to Eudora first, which was right, and Eudora sat with her on the porch of the ranch house in the afternoon sun, and they talked about teaching and about the school, and about the fact that Cimarron was growing and might, in time, need 2 teachers. I want to teach, Della said. I want to teach the way you taught me. How did I teach you? Eudora said, because she genuinely wanted to know how it had landed from the other side. Della thought about it. Like what I knew already mattered, she said. Like I was not starting from nothing, just adding to what was already there. Eudora was still for a moment with the weight of that. That is exactly right, she said. That is what I was trying to do. Then I want to do that, Della said. When the new school year began in September, Cimarron had 2 teachers, and the school had 14 students, and Silas Beaumont had finally, after 3 years of losing to Ruiz and Foot on every issue that mattered, resigned from the school board and been replaced by a man who had no interests in the Maxwell Land Grant Company at all, which was not the end of anything, because these things do not simply end, but it was the clearing of an obstacle. William turned 2 in July of that year. He was, by this point, an entirely formed person with very specific opinions about horses, which he loved, and vegetables, which he did not, and his father, of whom he had a quantity of feeling that he expressed by following James around the ranch at a close distance, from the time his legs were reliable enough to sustain the following. James accepted this devotion with a seriousness that Eudora found almost unbearably dear. He talked to William about what he was doing while he was doing it, not in the simplified register of condescension, but in his normal way, explaining things, asking questions, treating the 2-year-old's responses with the same considered attention he brought to everything. She stood in the yard one afternoon and watched James showing William how to hold a piece of harness leather, James on one knee, William in his small boots and his father's hat that had fallen over his eyes, and she thought about what James had told her that night in the saloon, that he had been alone too long to change, and she thought about what she had told him back. She had not asked him to change, and he had not changed. He was, fundamentally, the same person she had met in Pearl's Mercantile 3 years earlier, careful, solitary, honest, given to silence, requiring nothing from others that he was not willing to give fully in return. He was not easy at gatherings. He was not given to public warmth. He could still spend an entire morning without speaking and find it adequate, but he was here. He had chosen, every day since that night in the schoolhouse, to be here. Not because she had changed him, but because the being here had grown from what was already true in him, the loyalty, the depth of care, the capacity for love that had never gone away but had simply been kept in the dark and the cold for 8 years and had come back into the light not because anyone had asked it to be different but because someone had stood in front of it and said, "I see you, as you are, and I am not going anywhere." She crossed the yard to them. James looked up. William looked up and grinned the gap-toothed grin of a 2-year-old who has just learned something. "Harness," William said, holding up the leather strip with enormous pride. "Yes," she said. "Very good." She put her hand in James's shoulder, and he put his hand over hers without looking away from William, and they stood together in the late afternoon of the New Mexico summer with the mountains rising behind them and the horses in the pasture and the cottonwoods along the creek and the smell of warm grass and sage. "We are going to need a larger kitchen," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Are we?" he said, and there was a care in the question, a wanting to be sure. "We are," she said. He absorbed this. Then he smiled, the full, real smile, the one that changed his face entirely. "I know where I can get the timber," he said. In the November of 1881, James Donnelly began building the addition to the kitchen of the Caldera Ranch, with Manuel and Teodora's help, and with William providing comprehensive supervision from a safe distance established by his mother. It went up over 3 weeks, larger than the original kitchen, with 2 new windows and a second door, and a proper pantry with shelves that James built and Eudora arranged immediately. Her books in the small adjoining room that she called her office, and he called her office, and that was hers entirely. The room where she prepared her lessons and wrote her letters, and kept the notebook in which she had been writing down, in the evenings, the history of this place and its people as she had come to understand it. She was not certain anyone would ever read it. She wrote it anyway, because some things need to be written down in order to be kept, and the things that happened in ordinary lives in ordinary places were as much history as anything else. William James Donnelly, who was 2½ and in possession of very strong feelings about most things, christened the new kitchen by knocking a jar of molasses off the shelf and sitting down in the resulting situation with an expression of pure scientific interest. James cleaned him up with the patience of a man who has accepted that this is simply part of the work, and William, cleaned and deposited in the corner with a piece of bread and a tin cup of water, looked at his father with the pure, uncomplicated love of a child who has no doubt whatsoever about being loved back. The new baby came in the spring of 1882. A girl this time, which was William's position on the matter, expressed at length and with certainty for the 6 months of his mother's pregnancy, as if he had placed an order. She arrived on an April morning when the cottonwoods were just leafing, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the whole valley was that particular green of early spring that seems almost too vivid to be real. They named her Clara, which Eudora had offered, and James had received with the look of a man who understands that love and memory are not competitors, and who is grateful, deeply and permanently, for a woman who understands this too. Clara Donnelly arrived with a great deal of hair, and a set of opinions about comfort that she expressed without ambiguity, and William, who had in fact wanted a sister, was immediately and comprehensively devoted to her, which manifested as standing beside her cradle and informing her about horses at length. Eudora lay in the bed in the April light with her daughter on her chest, and her husband sitting beside her on the edge of the bed, and her son stationed by the cradle with the gravity of a person who has accepted a significant responsibility. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Cimarron 3 years earlier with a carpetbag and a dead husband's debts and a stubborn refusal to be broken. She had not been broken. She had been built. Not the way construction goes, board by deliberate board, but the way things grow by finding what they need and moving toward it, by the slow, unstoppable accumulation of ordinary days, by the specific grace of being known and knowing in return. James put his hand on her hair very gently. "Are you all right?" he asked, as he always asked, because the first thing was always whether she was all right. "I am entirely all right," she said. "I am better than all right." "Good," he said. She looked at him. The afternoon light was on his face, the face that had been made by 15 years of sun and wind and solitude, and that was now also made by this, by her, by William, by Clara, by the fullness that had grown from the root of him and was still entirely him. He had not changed. He had simply finally come home. And she thought about everything she had wanted to say that night in the saloon, all the things she had not said because some things are better shown than said, better lived than spoken, better grown than announced. She had not asked him to change. She had asked him only to let her in, and he had. And the country around them was vast and ancient and indifferent and beautiful in the specific way of places that do not require anything from you but presence. And the mountain stood in the late afternoon like something that had always been true. And the ranch was full of the sounds of April and new life, and the creek running and horses in the pasture and William explaining horses to Clara in detail, and James Donnelly, who had been alone too long to chain, held his wife's hand in the light of his home and was at last completely the fullest version of himself, not changed but opened, not altered but arrived, not rescued but recognized. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Pearl Gutierrez came out the following Sunday with a pot of chicken and rice, and a cake that she claimed she had made for practical reasons and not sentiment, and she stood in the new kitchen and looked at the family and the house and the life that had been built here, and for just a moment her composure shifted and she pressed her lips together and looked away out the window. "Pearl," Eudora said with warmth. "I'm not crying," Pearl said. "Of course not," James said. "It is the altitude," Pearl said firmly. William came in from outside with mud on his boots and very important news about one of the mares, which he delivered to James with the urgency of a report, and the two of them went out, and Clara slept in the cradle in the corner with the complete abandon of the very new, and Eudora and Pearl stood together in the kitchen that smelled of good food and spring air and the particular warmth of a house that is a home. "I told you," Pearl said. "He was the best man in the county." "You did," Eudora said. And Pearl said. Eudora thought about everything contained in that question, about the stage arriving in a red dust afternoon, and the man in Pearl's mercantile who had not said a word more than the transaction required, and the night in the saloon and the words that had changed everything and all the days since that had been made of those words, the ordinary and extraordinary weight of them, the way a thing said truly and meant fully could open years like a door. "And," she said, "you were right." Pearl nodded once, with the satisfaction of a woman who is always right about the things that matter, and she served the food, and the family came in from the pasture, and the afternoon went into evening, and the mountains turned the colors they turned at dusk, rose and violet, and then the deep blue of the New Mexico night, and the lamp was lit in the window of the Caldera Ranch, visible from the road north of Cimarron, a steady light in the dark of the high country. A person passing on that road in the spring of 1882 might have seen it and thought, "Someone lives there. Someone is home." They were right. Someone was home. Both of them were home. For the first time in a long time, and for all the time after, they were entirely, completely, unhesitatingly home.